Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andy Hopper, and I'm a member of the Council of the Royal Society, and I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture. By way of preliminary announcements, could I ask you to switch your mobile phones off? And off means off. Thank you very much. The event is being webcast and recorded, and I know there's quite a big audience out there in cyberspace communicating with us in one way or another, or perhaps us with them. So we're rather more populous than might appear just now. So our speaker this evening is James Gleick. James worked for 10 years as an editor and reporter for the New York Times and currently divides his time between New York and Florida, Key West, I think, or something. He's a best-selling author, and I'll read them all out. Chaos, Making a New Science. Genius, The Life and Science of Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner. Faster, The Acceleration of Just About Everything. What Just Happened, A Chronicle from the Information Frontier. And Isaac Newton, for the information, which is what we'll hear about today. His first book from 1987, Chaos, has been translated into 25 languages and was a National Book Award finalist. And his best-selling biographies, Genius and Isaac Newton, in 1992 and 2003, were shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. And of course, in this parish of the Royal Society, we're very pleased when people write up fellows, such as Newton, because I will remind you he became a fellow in 1672, so we're very pleased about that. The information, the book published in March in the United States on the 1st of April here in the UK, was 7 or 8 years in the making. So we look forward to hearing about information, Shannon, others, why we are so keen on this connectedness. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to present to you James Gleick. James.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Hopper. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be here at the Royal Society. The archivists here were extremely kind to me 10 years ago when I was working on my book about Newton, and I'm an American. It's impossible not to be in awe of the history of this place. I want to begin at a specific place and time that was a sort of turning point in history. The year was 1948. You could say that 1948 marks the beginning of what people like to call the information age. Or, to put it another way, it's the moment when people began to realize that all human history was the information age. As it happened, 1948 was when the Bell Telephone Laboratories announced the invention of an amazingly simple device that could do anything a vacuum tube could do, and more efficiently. It was a tiny electronic semiconductor, a crystalline sliver so small that 100 would fit in the palm of a hand. In May, scientists formed a committee to come up with a name, and the committee passed out paper ballots to the senior engineers in Murray Hill, New Jersey, listing some choices. Semiconductor triode, iotatron, Then someone mashed up transconductance and varistor and got the word transistor. And of course, that was the winner. Bell Labs put out a press release saying it may have far-reaching significance in electronics and electrical communication. And for once, the reality surpassed the hype. The transistor put electronics on its path of miniaturization and ubiquity, and soon won the Nobel Prize for its three chief inventors. For the laboratory, it was the jewel in the crown. But it was only the second most significant development of that year. The transistor was only hardware. An invention more profound, more fundamental, came in a monograph spread across 79 pages of the Bell System Technical Journal in July and October. No one bothered with a press release. It carried a title both simple and grand, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And the message was hard to summarize, but it was a fulcrum around which the world began to turn. Like the transistor, this development also involved a neologism, the word bit, chosen in this case not by committee, but by the lone author, a 32-year-old named Claude Shannon. The bit now joined the inch, the pound, the quart, and the minute as a determinate quantity, a fundamental unit of measure. But measuring what? A unit for measuring information, Shannon wrote, as though there were such a thing, measurable and quantifiable, as information. People considered Shannon a smart young man. He was from northern Michigan, the rural Midwest, a place where he saw wires every day, barbed wires stretching from post to post, fencing the pastures. This was a time when people in the countryside were forming barbed wire telephone cooperatives rather than waiting for the big city telephone company. Claude Shannon, as a boy, scrounged parts and jerry-rigged his own barbed wire telegraph, tapping messages to another boy a half-mile away. He used the code devised by Samuel F.B. Morse. He liked codes. He liked secret codes, which he read about in stories by Edgar Allan Poe. He gathered threads like a magpie. When he went east to study at MIT, he worked as a research assistant running Vannevar Bush's giant new differential analyzer, a 100-ton iron platform of rotating shafts and gears, which newspapers were calling a thinking machine. It's obvious to us, in retrospect, that the differential analyzer was a successor to Charles Babbage's difference engine, but no one knew that at the time. At 22, Shannon wrote a master's thesis that applied a 19th century idea, George Boole's algebra of logic, to the design of electrical circuits. Logic and electricity. That was a peculiar combination, unless you considered the possibility that what passes from one circuit to another isn't merely electricity, but rather a sort of fact, open or closed, true or false. It would be an understatement to say that this wasn't a typical topic for a master's thesis in electrical engineering. Later, Shannon worked with the mathematician and logician Hermann Weyl, who taught him what a theory was. As Weyl put it, theories permit consciousness to jump over its own shadow, to leave behind the given, to represent the transcendent, yet, as is self-evident, only in symbols. Then, Shannon was plunged into war work at Bell Labs, first developing an automatic fire control director for anti-aircraft guns, then focusing on the theoretical underpinnings of secret communication, cryptography, and working out a mathematical proof of the security of the so-called X system, the telephone hotline between Churchill and Roosevelt. Shannon supposedly belonged to the Bell Labs Mathematical Research Group. But mostly he kept to himself. After the war, when the group left the New York headquarters for shiny new space in the New Jersey suburbs, he stayed behind, haunting a cubbyhole in the old building, a 12-story sandy brick hulk wedged between the Hudson River and Greenwich Village. He disliked commuting. And he liked the downtown neighborhood, where he could hear jazz clarinetists in late-night clubs. He was flirting with a young woman who worked in Bell Labs' microwave research group in the 2-story former Nabisco factory across the street. Anyway, his managers were willing to let him alone, even though they didn't understand exactly what he was working on. AT&T, at mid-century, didn't demand instant gratification from its research division. It allowed detours into mathematics and physics with no apparent commercial purpose. Anyway, so much of modern science bore directly or indirectly on the company's mission. Still, broad as it was, the company's core subject matter remained just out of focus. By 1948, more than 125 million conversations passed daily across the Bell system's wires and switches. The system had 138 million miles of cable and 31 million telephone sets. The Bureau of the Census reported these facts under the rubric of communications in the United States, but they were crude measures of communication. The census also counted several thousand broadcasting stations for radio and a few dozen for television, along with newspapers, books, pamphlets, and the mail. The post office counted its letters and parcels, but what exactly did the Bell system carry? Counted in what units? Not conversations, surely, nor words, nor certainly characters. Perhaps it was just electricity. The company's engineers were electrical engineers. Shannon himself, as a student, had never been quite able to decide whether to become an engineer or a mathematician. For Bell Labs, he was both, practical about circuits and relays, but most at home in a mental world, fascinated by layers of symbolic abstraction. In 1943, the mathematician and codebreaker Alan Turing visited Bell Labs on a cryptographic mission and met Shannon sometimes over lunch, where they traded speculation on the future of artificial thinking machines. Turing told a friend, Shannon wants to feed not just data to her brain, but cultural things. He wants to play music to it. Shannon also crossed paths with Norbert Wiener, who had taught him at MIT, and by 1948 was proposing a new discipline to be called cybernetics, the study of communication and control. Meanwhile, Shannon began paying special attention to television signals from a peculiar point of view, wondering whether their content could somehow be compacted or compressed to allow for faster transmission. Logic and circuits crossbred to make a new hybrid thing. In his solitary way, seeking a framework to connect his many threads, Shannon began assembling a theory for information. He didn't call it that at first. He wrote to Vannevar Bush, "Off and on, I have been working on an analysis of some of the fundamental properties of general systems for the transmission of intelligence." Intelligence was a flexible term, very old. In the 16th century, Thomas Eliot wrote that it was an elegant word used where there is mutual treaties or appointments, either by letters or message. Suddenly that sounds a little bit modern. The word intelligence mostly meant something else, though. A few engineers, especially in the telephone labs, began speaking of information. They used the word in a way suggesting something technical, quantity of information or measure of information. For the purposes of science, information had to mean something special. It had to be made mathematical and exact. Isaac Newton had done that with words like motion and force, ancient, vague words that he gave new meanings. In the 19th century, the word energy underwent the same transformation. Natural philosophers adapted a word meaning vigor or intensity, figured out how to measure it, and gave it a fundamental place in the physicist's view of nature. Now, in the mid-20th century, it was the same with information. A rite of purification became necessary. And then, when it was made simple, distilled, counted in bits, information was found to be everywhere. Shannon's theory linked information to uncertainty, to entropy, to chaos. It made a sort of foundation for our world, leading to compact disks and fax machines, computers and cyberspace, Moore's law, and all the world's silicon alleys. Information processing was born. People began to talk about a successor to the Iron Age and the Steam Age. Marshall McLuhan remarked in 1967, "Man, the food gatherer, reappears incongruously as information gatherer." He wrote this an instant too soon, in the first dawn of computation and cyberspace. We can see now that information is what our world runs on, the blood and the fuel, the vital principle. It pervades the sciences from top to bottom, transforming every branch of knowledge. Even biology has become an information science, a subject of messages, instructions, and codes. Genes encapsulate information and enable procedures for reading it in and writing it out. Life spreads by networking. The body itself is an information processor, storing its data not just in brains, but in every cell. No wonder genetics bloomed along with information theory. DNA is the quintessential information molecule, an alphabet and a code. 6 billion bits to form a human being. Richard Dawkins famously declares, "What lies at the heart of every living thing is not a fire, not warm breath, not a spark of life. It is information, words, instructions. If you want to understand life, don't think about vibrant, throbbing gels and oozes. Think about information technology." Evolution itself embodies an ongoing exchange of information between organism and environment. Werner Lowenstein, after 30 years spent studying intercellular communication, says, "The information circle becomes the unit of life." And he reminds us that information means something deeper now. It connotes a cosmic principle of organization and order, and it provides an exact measure of that. So, back to the beginning. The story has always been about information. In the beginning was the Word, according to John, but in 1981, the philosopher Fred Dretske offered an amendment. In the beginning was information, the Word came later. We're the species that named itself Homo sapiens, the one who knows, and then, after reflection, amended that to Homo sapiens sapiens. The greatest gift of Prometheus to humanity was not fire, after all. He boasted, "Numbers 2, chiefest of sciences, I invented for them, and the combining of letters, creative mother of the muses' art, with which to hold all things in memory." We are in a position to appreciate that the alphabet was a founding technology of information, that the telephone, the fax machine, the calculator, and ultimately the computer are only the latest innovations in a long sequence. Our furniture includes iPods and plasma displays. Our skills include texting and Googling. We are endowed. We are expert. So we see information in the foreground. But it's always been there. It pervaded our ancestors' world, too, taking forms from solid to ethereal, old granite gravestones and the whispers of courtiers, the punched card, the cash register, the 19th century difference engine, the wires of telegraphy, all played their parts in weaving the spider web of information to which we cling. Hardly any information technology goes obsolete. Each new one throws its predecessors into relief. So Thomas Hobbes, in the 17th century, resisted his era's new media hype. The invention of printing, though ingenious, compared with the invention of letters, is no great matter. Then, as of 50 years ago, Marshall McLuhan considered us citizens of the electric age. He said, "We are today as far into the electric age as the Elizabethans had advanced into the typographical and mechanical age, and we are experiencing the same confusions and indecisions which they felt when living simultaneously in two contrasted forms of society and experience." McLuhan's electric age had no email, no web surfing, nor even cell phones, much less Facebook and Twitter. McLuhan was mainly watching television, and it was a fuzzy sort of television at that. We don't call it the electric age anymore. But McLuhan was right. We are still experiencing confusions and indecisions, more now than ever. As the role of information grows beyond anyone's reckoning, it grows to be too much. TMI, people now say. We have information fatigue, anxiety, and glut. We have met the devil of information overload and his impish underlings, the computer virus, the busy signal, the dead link, the PowerPoint presentation. There's a universally recognized metaphor for our current predicament. The word is flood. There's a sensation of drowning, of information as a rising, churning deluge. Data washes over us from above and below. One may lose the ability to impose order on the chaos of sensations. Truth seems hard to find amid a multitude of plausible fictions. This feels new and raw and unprecedented. But of course it isn't. In 2007, we had David Foster Wallace writing about the tsunami of available fact, context, and perspective. But in 1621, we have Robert Burton writing about new news every day, a vast confusion of vows, wishes, actions, edicts, petitions, lawsuits, pleas, laws, proclamations, complaints, grievances, daily brought to our ears. New books every day, pamphlets, corantos, stories, whole catalogs of volumes of all sorts, new paradoxes, opinions, schisms, heresies, controversies in philosophy, religion, etc. And Burton wasn't even on Facebook. Or Twitter. I don't think he ever wrote a sentence as short as 140 characters. Anyway, the printing press was enough to give the 17th century a feeling of information overload. Gottfried Leibniz feared a return to barbarism, to which result that horrible mass of books which keeps on growing might contribute very much, for in the end the disorder will become nearly insurmountable. It was to cope with this flood that clever people invented new species of information organizers: dictionaries, cyclopedias, almanacs, compendiums of words, classifiers of facts, trees of knowledge, all, of course, enabled by the same wretched printers who were causing the problem. It is exactly in the same spirit that we have Yahoo and Google and Wikipedia and the rest of their oddly named species, and we generate unintended irony. We write astounding numbers of new books each year about information glut. Amazon transmits messages like, "Start reading Data Smog on your Kindle in under a minute." And, "Surprise me, see a random page in this book." Facts were once dear. Now they're cheap. Once, people would turn to the pages of Whitaker's Almanac, published yearly, or the World Almanac in the United States, to find the names and dates of monarchs and presidents, tables of holidays and high water, sizes and populations of faraway places, or the ships and chief officers of the Navy. Lacking the almanac or seeking an even more obscure fact, they might call on a man or woman of experience behind a desk at the public library. When George Bernard Shaw needed the whereabouts of the nearest crematorium, his wife was dying, he opened the almanac, and he was aggrieved. He wrote to the editor, "I have just found an astonishing omission in Whitaker. As the desired information is just what one goes to your invaluable almanac for, may I suggest that a list of the 58 crematoria now working in the country and instructions what to do would be a very desirable addition." His letter is poignant. He doesn't mention his wife, only a case of serious illness, and he refers to himself as the bereaved inquirer. Shaw took it for granted that facts were to be found in print, even though he had a telegraph address and a telephone. By that time, many other people were using the telephone to reach out for information. People realized that they could know instantly the scores of sporting events that they hadn't witnessed. So many came up with the idea of telephoning a newspaper that the New York Times in 1929 felt compelled to print a front-page notice begging readers to desist. Don't ask by telephone for World Series scores. Now, the information in real time is considered a birthright. We still have to find it, of course. Not the sports scores, those are everywhere. But the directory of all UK crematorium is under construction online. I Googled it yesterday. We've learned very well that it's not enough for information to exist. A file was originally, in the 16th century, a wire on which slips and bills and notes and letters could be strung for preservation or for reference. Then came file folders, file drawers, file cabinets. Then the electronic namesakes of all these. And the irony in all these cases is the same. Once a piece of paper is filed, it is statistically unlikely ever to be seen again. Even in 1847, the mathematician Augustus de Morgan knew this. He said that for any random book, a library was no better than a waste paper warehouse. He said, take the library of the British Museum, for instance, valuable and useful and accessible as it is, what chance has a work of being known to be there merely because it is there? If it be wanted, it can be asked for, but to be wanted, it must be known. Nobody can rummage the library. Too much information, and so much of it lost. An unindexed internet site is in the same limbo as a misshelved library book. That's why the successful and powerful business enterprises of the information economy are built on filtering and searching. Most of what it finds, Google, for example, calls itself a search engine, but its usefulness comes just as much from filtering. Most of what it finds is garbage. When our query produces 1 million results, it's crucial for Google to spare us the last 999,000. When information is cheap, attention becomes expensive. Way back in 1990, when the internet was a gleam on the horizon, the philosopher Daniel Dennett speculated on how electronic networks might upend the economics of publishing. He was thinking about poetry. Imagine, he said, what if instead of slim books, elegant specialty items marketed to connoisseurs, poets could publish online? They might reach not hundreds, but millions of readers instantly, not for tens of dollars, but for fractions of pennies. That same year, the publisher Charles Chadwick Healy, walking one day through the British Library, conceived of what he called the English Poetry Full-Text Database. And 4 years later, he had produced it, not online, but in 4 compact discs, 165,000 poems by 1,250 poets spanning 13 centuries, priced at $51,000. Readers and critics had to figure out what to make of this. Not read it, surely, the way they would read a book. Read in it, perhaps. Search it for a half-remembered fragment. Anthony Lane reviewed the database for The New Yorker and described the experience this way. You hunch like a pianist over the keys, knowing what awaits you, thinking, the untold wealth of English literature. What hidden jewels I shall excavate from the deepest mines of human fancy. Then it quickly transpires that the jewels are outnumbered by the clunkers. The flood of bombast and mediocrity, the sheer unordered mass, can wear you down. Not that Lane sounds at all weary. What a steaming heap, he cries. Never have I beheld such a magnificent tribute to the powers of human incompetence, and also by the same token to the blessings of human forgetfulness. He cites, by way of example, a funny self-referential couplet by the utterly forgotten Thomas Freeman, circa 1610. Whoop, whoop, methinks I hear my reader cry, here is rhyme doggerel, I confess it, I. And by the way, after Lane quoted this in The New Yorker, Thomas Freeman finally got his entry in Wikipedia. The CD-ROMs are already obsolete. All English poetry is in the network now, or if not all, some approximation thereof, and if not now, then soon. This has consequences, and some of them are strange. We're only beginning to appreciate how we ourselves are altered when we have at our fingertips all the poetry, all the books, for that matter, all the music and all the twittering. Swamped as we are with the present instant, we may feel amnesia. We may feel our sense of history foreshortened. But the past is more with us than ever. It folds, accordion-like, into the present. We recover the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yellowed newspapers come back to life online. Under headings of 50 years ago and 100 years ago, all sorts of publications recycle their archives. Recipes, card play techniques, science, gossip, once out of print, now ready for reuse. Record companies rummage through their attics to release or re-release every scrap of music, rarities, B-sides, and bootlegs. For a certain time, collectors scholars, or fans possessed their books and records. There was a line between what they had and what they did not. For some, the music they owned, or the books or the videos, became part of who they were. That line now fades away. Most of Sophocles' plays are lost, but those that survive are available to us at the touch of a button. Most of Bach's music was unknown to Beethoven. We have it all, partitas, cantatas, and ringtones. It comes to us instantly, or at light speed. It's a variety of omniscience. It's what the critic Alex Ross calls the infinite playlist. And he sees how mixed is the blessing. Anxiety in place of fulfillment, an addictive cycle of craving and malaise. No sooner has one experience begun than the thought of what else is out there intrudes. And all this is preserved. It seems ephemeral, living in that notional place we call the cloud, not visible, not tangible, often not even situated in any one place, but distributed, as the engineers like to say, across the network. People have the illusion that it may easily vanish, evaporate. But I think the opposite is true. Information has never been so persistent. The information produced and consumed by humankind used to vanish. That was the norm, the default. The sights, the sounds, the songs, the spoken word just melted away. Marks on stone, parchment, or paper were the special case. It didn't occur to Sophocles' audiences that it would be a tragedy for his plays to be lost. They just enjoyed the show. Now expectations have inverted. Everything may be recorded, at least potentially. Every musical performance, every crime in a shop, elevator, or city street, every earthquake on the remotest shore, every card played or piece moved in an online game, every rugby scrum and cricket match. Having a camera at hand is normal, not exceptional. Something like 5 billion images were captured last year. YouTube streams more than 2 billion videos a day. I could give you a statistic for Twitter, too, but it would be obsolete before we leave the room. Many national libraries are actively preserving web pages, and the U.S. Library of Congress is even archiving the world's tweets. What takes effort is forgetting. To forget used to be a failing. Now it becomes a skill. One thing we know about information now, or should know, is that we don't own it. It's not ours. It's not about us. It surrounds us. It precedes us. We are adjusting to a shift of perspective that resembles the demise of the geocentric universe. It should be humbling. The biologist Jacques Monod proposed 40 years ago that we think about an abstract kingdom that rises above the biosphere. Its denizens are ideas. He wrote, "Ideas have retained some of the properties of organisms. Like them, they tend to perpetuate their structure and to breed. They too can fuse, recombine, segregate their content. Indeed, they too can evolve, and in this evolution, selection must play an important role." He was talking about memes, but this didn't become clear until a few years later when Richard Dawkins invented the word. The meme is the gene's cultural analog. It's a replicator and propagator, an idea, a fashion, a chain letter, or a conspiracy theory. On a bad day, a meme is a virus. Memes emerge in brains and travel outward, establishing beachheads on paper and celluloid and silicon and anywhere else information can go. They're not to be thought of as elementary particles, but as organisms. As Dawkins would say, we are their vehicles and their enablers. For most of our biological history, their main mode of transmission was the one called word of mouth. Lately, however, they've managed to adhere in solid substance. Clay tablets, cave walls, paper sheets. They achieve longevity. Now they propagate via broadcast towers and digital networks. They are self-replicating patterns of information. They live in an abstract kingdom, which we may call the InfoSphere. Most of the biosphere can't see the InfoSphere. It's invisible, a parallel universe humming with ghostly inhabitants. But they're not ghosts to us, not anymore. We humans, alone among the Earth's organic creatures, live in both worlds at once. It's as though, having long coexisted with the unseen, we've begun to develop the needed extrasensory perception. We are aware of the many species of information. We name their types sardonically, as though to reassure ourselves that we understand urban myths and zombie lies. We keep them alive in air-conditioned server farms. But we cannot own them. When a jingle lingers in our ears, or a fad turns fashion upside down, or a hoax dominates the global chatter for months and vanishes as swiftly as it came, we may well ask, who's in charge? We create information, but we're also made of information. That's what genes are, after all. Plenty of physicists go even further and treat the bit as their fundamental particle. The great quantum theorist John Archibald Wheeler, in the last years of his life, promulgated a slogan, "It from bit." He said, information gives rise to every it, every particle, every field of force, even the space-time continuum itself. The point is that when photons and electrons and other particles interact, what they're really doing is exchanging bits, transmitting quantum states, processing information. And the laws of physics are the algorithms. Every burning star, every silent nebula, every particle leaving its ghostly trace in a cloud chamber is an information processor. Wheeler never apologized for asking questions more than providing answers. He said, not long before he died, if and when we learn how to combine bits in fantastically large numbers to obtain what we call existence, we will know better what we mean, both by bit and by existence. All this, too, is due in its roundabout way to Shannon. One day in the summer of 1949, Shannon took a pencil and a piece of notebook paper, drew a line from top to bottom, and wrote the powers of 10. From tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, trillions, all the way to 10 to the 13th. He labeled this axis bits storage capacity. He began listing some items that might be said to store information. A digit wheel, the kind used in a desktop adding machine, 10 decimal digits, represents just over 3 bits. At just under 10 to the third bits, he wrote, punched card all config allowed. At 10 to the fourth, he put page single-spaced typing, 32 possible symbols. Near 10 to the fifth, he wrote something offbeat. Genetic constitution of man. There was no real precedent for this in current scientific thinking in 1949. James Watson was a 21-year-old student of zoology in Indiana. Francis Crick had just switched from physics into biology. I think Shannon's doodling was the first time anyone suggested that the genome was an information store measurable in bits. His guess was off by at least 4 orders of magnitude. He thought a phonorecord 128 levels held more information, about 300,000 bits. To the 10 million level, he assigned a thick professional journal, and to 1 billion, the Encyclopedia Britannica, he estimated 1 hour of Technicolor movie at 10 to the 12th. Finally, just under his pencil mark for 10 to the 14th, 100 trillion bits, he put the largest information stockpile he could think of, the Library of Congress. That doesn't seem so big to us now. We can hold that many bits in one hand, thanks to Moore's law. We call them terabytes. We talk about petabytes, exabytes, and yottabytes. As for Shannon himself, he died in 2001 without ever having become what you'd call a household name. He wasn't much for making grand predictions about the future. Once, in the 1950s, he went out on a limb and said, "I think that this present century, in a sense, will see a great upsurge and development of this whole information business, the business of collecting information and the business of transmitting it from one point to another, and perhaps most important of all, the business of processing it." Well, that happened. After he died, one of Shannon's Bell Labs contemporaries mused, "It is hard to picture the world before Shannon as it seemed to those who lived in it. It is difficult to recover innocence, ignorance, and lack of understanding." Thank you. Oh, okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there is time for questions. There will be a microphone, and because we are recording, if you'd kindly wait until it arrives before you speak, so we have an archive and our friends in cyberspace can hear as well. So please go ahead with your questions.
So the information doesn't vanish into the ether.
Yes.
Just a question of information.
And if you'd kindly stand up as well so we can see what who you are.
Quite early on in your talk, you mentioned a mathematician. I couldn't quite get his name. Was it Weil?
Weil.
Weil.
Yes, Weil. W-E-Y-Y-L.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed for your talk. Maybe I represent the epitome of ignorance and lack of understanding. I did a course in cybernetics about 55 years ago, and I'm out of date since. On the basis of what you have said, and I'm particularly worried that you say the Library of Congress is actually archiving all the tweets. I know you've only got an hour in which to make your lecture, but there doesn't seem to be a distinction between what I would call information, something that's fruitful, and stuff which we would call as clutter. Also, what may be regarded as information, say, through Richard Dawkins, might be regarded not so by the Pope, and vice versa. So I think there needs to be, if you could refine the concept of information a little more, I'd be most grateful.
Well, if I could, all our problems would be solved. In a way, you're expressing very well the central dilemma of my book, or what turned out to be the dilemma as I wrote it. And that is, Shannon, as I've just described, begins by mathematicizing the word information, by making information a rather desiccated thing. He explicitly says that meaning is irrelevant for engineering purposes, and he says this over and over again. It's a point he has to emphasize because it's so counterintuitive. And then in the years that followed the publication of what's now called information theory, years when his ideas began to spread to other disciplines, a lot of scientists in fields like psychology and sociology, quite understandably, were repelled by that notion. They said, well, if that's what you mean when you say information, you're not talking about what I call information. You're talking about beeps. You might as well call it signal theory. This, to my mind, exactly reflects the situation in which we find ourselves when information is everywhere, and yet most of it, as you suggest, might be considered garbage. The Library of Congress is archiving billions of tweets. It almost goes without saying that 140 characters doesn't let you express a thought of great profundity that's likely to be a contribution to knowledge. So the gap between information and knowledge, and then again, the gap between knowledge and wisdom, is still there. I don't think that's a new problem. I think that's always been the human condition, and it's maybe more front and center now than ever before.
Gentleman in the front and then gentleman behind next.
Did Shannon die rich?
No, not at all. He wasn't particularly concerned, I think, about making money. His career took him after Bell Labs to MIT. He was very well known in the business, right?
God.
A god. But he wasn't a household name. Most people still haven't heard of him, I don't think. I wrote a sort of obituary of him in the New York Times that year in 2001, and most people it took some persuading to get the editors to give it the treatment it deserved. No, there are academics in the information business today who managed to get rich, but Shannon, I don't think, particularly tried.
Philip Coghlan, retired engineer. I'm not sure if I've really formulated my question very well yet, so I'll make it up as I go along. But I think you've suggested once or twice that complex natural systems could be described as information or reducible to information. Now, I don't know whether you've meant that, but you seem to have described it that way, particularly when you referred to Dawkins and the idea of the gene. Now, you probably know that some people say that complex systems, if you try to reproduce them as anything else other than the system itself, will never actually be an accurate reproduction of that system. So if you really do mean, or anybody else means, that you could reduce complex systems to descriptions using just information theory, you are not accurately describing those systems. And the only way to see how and whether something works is to observe the system. And trying to describe it with information is really only an approximation. That's not a question, I'm sorry, it's a point. My question is, did you mean to suggest that?
You should ask for an abstract.
Yes and no. I didn't mean to suggest that everything is reducible to information. Reducible is a loaded word. Before we talked about bits, people talked about atoms, and the same kind of question was asked, and it still is everything really reducible to fundamental particles? Is everything in the universe reducible, for that matter, to the laws of physics? These are ancient questions, and to some extent they're religious questions. To the extent that they're religious, I hardly need tell you that they're above my pay grade. In another way, though, and this brings this goes back to the subject of my first book, Chaos. This is exactly what it was about. Science has learned that what appear to be very complex systems do emerge from simple descriptions. This is, again, it can be a religious point. For example, there are people who believe that we human beings are not merely material creatures, that our brains, that our souls, ourselves, are not just made of physical things. They're not just a bunch of neurons and electrical impulses. I'm actually not one of those people. I tend to think that everything we are is what you see. Not literally what you see, you know what I mean. That there's nothing spiritual that's required to explain them. That doesn't mean that I think we're anywhere close to the time when, as in science fiction stories, everything that composes ourselves will be capable of storage on a hard disk somewhere. But it doesn't mean that that time will never come either. I'm sorry I can't answer that more definitively.
This gentleman in the blue shirt just over there. Next.
Hello, Andre Powell, still practicing as an engineer. A question, we have this flood of information. Do you think that's actually deteriorated the joy of knowing because we can just instantly access? I can remember at university just finding out one or two facts and thinking, cool, we know this. But having this raft of information to know, well, I can find that out at any time. What's your opinion on that?
I think we're adjusting our sense of what it means to know things. I don't think, I mean, of course, in a sense, the fact that you can just snap your fingers and get the answer to a factual question diminishes the value of the answer in a way. Maybe it's too easy. In maybe a slightly deeper sense, the process of seeking information is something we all value. That is, you read a long book, or you go to the library and page through many books. And not only do you do those concrete things, but you have to do some thinking. You puzzle things out, and all of that is a part of finding what may, in the end, just be a fact. So I think what you're saying is, if you lose those valuable pieces of the process, then you're just left with a dry shell, which is the fact. I tend to be a little more optimistic than that, and think that our capacity for thinking great thoughts or creating valuable art or creating knowledge is what it is, and it will adjust to the new landscape. And if it's easier to find out the capital of Tanzania than it used to be, something else is going to be more difficult, and we're going to use our creativity in different directions. I could go on.
Thank you. Trevor Gibbons. You mentioned in passing that entropy was a concept that could be applied to information. Would you mind just expanding a little bit on how? Thank you.
In the 1 minute remaining, this is really difficult. This is where I really am very tempted to pass the baton over to Professor Hopper. But you don't have to take it if you don't want it.
I'll leave it with you. We have a little time.
No.
So.
Oh, no, I'll say something, though, if you don't want to. Well, I'll say one funny thing, which is that when Shannon used the word entropy in his initial papers on information theory. The reason he did that was it turned out that the math, he was coming up with a probabilistic way of measuring information. A message is one in a set of possible messages. It turned out that the math for that was exactly the same as the math in thermodynamics, where you have ensembles of physical systems, and the more ordered they are, the fewer possible ensembles there are, and so the probability of that particular system existing is much lower. And the word for that in thermodynamics was entropy. Maximal entropy being the most disorderly system. That's where the word makes a jump from one domain to the other. But the other thing to say about that is that when Shannon published this, the rumor went around Bell Labs, and it was not true, but it was persistent, that von Neumann had advised Shannon to use the word entropy and had told him, if you do that, nobody will know what you're talking about.
Good answer. One down the front. We've got a couple of gentlemen over there. Maybe someone over there.
Charlie Peck, I teach computer science. Moore's law describes how in some sense, how the power of technology grows over time. When you were looking at the rate of information collection, transmission, did you see any relationship between every 18 months doubling over long periods of time and the rate at which we either accumulate or communicate information?
I think that's definitely the case. Moore's law, as you know, and as the professor knows better than anyone in the room, I think, was specifically about chip density. Isn't that right?
Correct.
He was making predictions of
space on a transistor.
Yeah, and so he didn't say, our computers are going to have more memory exactly, although that we can see in retrospect that followed pretty naturally. It seems to me, I don't have hard evidence, but people try to produce statistics for this every year, that when you measure the number of bits that are supposedly transmitted through the world's communication networks, that number grows in more or less the same exponential fashion. And when you measure the number of bits that are being stored in the various media that we talk about, that number also grows exponentially. I don't think any of that is a coincidence. I don't think I'm saying anything especially controversial, but I also don't think it can be proved at this point.
Okay. One more. There was a hand up in the middle at the back, I thought. No? Okay, one more over here then. Final question for us.
Thank you. Harold Schuback. I'm not a scientist. I'm merely a humble lawyer. One thing, is there not a paradox? One thing that hasn't been mentioned is the quality of information. When you say, if one takes an example, if somebody says that the Earth is flat, that may be incorrect information on one level, but it is a fact that a particular person has said that the world is flat. What does one mean by information? The subject matter of the communication or the fact of the communication?
Now you're posing this in a way that sounds a little bit like a Zen koan or something. And what I mean by that, well, what makes me say that is, first of all, you've touched on an issue that we've discussed already, which is the question of whether information from which meaning has been subtracted is particularly useful. But you've also developed it into the next thing, which is, a word that we all hear a lot is the word meta. We talk about meta-mathematics and meta-information, which is information about information. And so the question you've asked is kind of, okay, if the underlying fact is false, isn't there a fact on top of that which has or may have some value? And this is just the fact that you ask a question like that and maybe everybody in the room understands it at some level is very revealing, I think, of the world we live in. This is advanced thinking about information, and it wasn't possible in the 19th century or before. It depended on the great philosophers of the 20th century to let us think in this way. I guess that's
very good.
About it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a super lecture. James, thank you very much for bringing Shannon and many other things, but Shannon in particular closer to us, one of my heroes, hugely important. We learned that forgetting is a skill, so good practice. We will all remember that there's a list of UK crematoria, so next time you need to find something like that, that'll be fine. Hey, listen, the bits of paper you file away are read very widely, so we very much hope that your book is as big a success as its predecessors. I hear it's already on the bestseller list. So all the very best with that, and thank you very much for a delightful, enjoyable, and intellectually sound lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.